Hi everyone, my name is Justin Weigart, and I'm one of the graduate coordinators for Graphic Possibilities here at Michigan State University. Today, I'm going to be going through the step-by-step process that we will take to generate some visualizations of Wikidata for our Spring 2021 Comics Wikidata event. First, I'll give a brief overview of our goals and the general process, then go in depth for each stage. It might feel a little obtuse at first, but my goal is to help you feel more confident to build out your own comics visualizations and provide a step-by-step tutorial for our spring event. So, our overarching goal is to investigate the connections between Wikidata and comics and to begin answering some large questions, like how can Wikidata liberate our thinking about comics? What narratives can we visualize with Wikidata? And also, what narratives are still absent? And so we're going to begin with, well, the beginning of comics publication history by generating visualizations of Wikidata associated with Golden Age comics publishers as our starting point. This activity builds on our Fall 2020 Wikidata event, where participants from around the globe joined to link MSU's comics metadata to Wikidata itself. We're going to be using two separate Wikidata visualization tools for this workshop. You see, Wikidata has a ton of really great open source, community-generated tools for working with Wikidata, and we're just going to be using two of these tools for our workshop. The first tool is called Wikidata Graph Builder, which visualizes Wikidata items in a graph format using d3.js. And the second is actually Wikidata's in-house SPARQL query service, which is a way for users to ask questions and pull out items from Wikidata, and therefore generate knowledge in the forms of lists, graphs, maps, and more. Each of these tools have a lot of depth to them, but for our purposes and for this workshop, we're just going to be working with these at a beginner level and use them in conjunction with one another to great effect. Before we begin, I want to mention that I will be showing this tutorial using a Windows computer and Google Chrome. Using other operating systems and browsers should work just fine, but things may look just slightly differently. So, first I'm going to go to Wikidata Graph Builder, and we're going to begin creating some baseline network visualizations of Golden Age comics using this tool. On the right, actually in the center here, you're going to see a whole mess of example graphs that are really cool. Things like the children of Agnes of Palatinate, or the people who were filmed with Jim Carrey, which is actually a really interesting template that we kind of built our model from. But we are interested in making our own using comics Wikidata. So if we go over here to the left, you'll see the different properties we can modify. Things like the mode of visualizing, the language, the root item, traversal property, iterations, limits, and more. What we can do is shape this tool a little bit for our purposes. So first, we're going to change our mode to undirected so we can see whatever the kinds of relationships are. And then we're going to put as our root item a Golden Age comics publisher. Let's say EC Comics. And as we start typing it in, our term pops up. We're also going to modify our traversal property so that when we are querying Wikidata, which is reliant on data being uploaded by communities like us, we're not necessarily querying something like the Grand Comics database or Wikipedia itself. So this list is not really going to be exhaustive. So instead, we're going to focus our traversal property, which is the specific kinds of labels that this service is going to crawl through and pull out for us. And again, in this case, what we're looking for is what EC Comics is labeled within Wikidata as a publisher of. It's a little tricky, but you'll get the hang of it, right? So we'll just type in publisher, click this, and for iterations, we're gonna put it up to 2. This is essentially like 6 degrees of Kevin Bacon, but in this case, it's kind of like what EC Comics is a publisher of, and then another step out. So we can kind of see, the different connections therein. And that's all we really need. And so we're going to click build. It might take you a little bit depending on what your query is. Larger queries will make it take forever and will make it really impossible to navigate. Smaller ones tend to work a little bit better. And so in this case, as I zoom in, what we see here is a kind of mobile fluid sort of network map. And this gives us a pretty clear network map of all the different things that EC Comics has published that are housed in Wikidata, but it's a little basic and it's a little plain, right? It doesn't tell us much of a story. We can see that these items are these items are related. that Weird Science is listed under EC Comics, and that EC Comics is listed as a publisher of all of these, but that's about it, right? This is where the kind of different iterations comes in, right? Where Mad is listed under EC Comics, but we also see that Spy versus Spy and DC Comics are related to Mad in slightly different ways. So for now, we're just going to leave this graph here. We're going to leave this network here, and we're going to go move over to query service, to our SPARQL query service. And the reason for that will kind of become clear once we start working with this. So keep this tab up. Now, moving over, we have a very complicated looking sort of SPARQL query service if you are unfamiliar with any of this. Because Wikidata is this massive repository, users need a way to use it as a knowledge base for their Wikidata projects, and they need a way to interact with it and ask questions of it. Enter SPARQL, S-P-A-R-Q-L, which is a semantic query language for databases that is able to retrieve and manipulate data. And that's a mouthful, but in short, it's a programming language that lets us search for patterns and labels and descriptions and other objects that are associated with all of our Wikidata items in our database. And so Wikidata has a ton of really great resources on how to learn SPARQL and work with it more in depth if you're interested. But we worked with Will Kent, our Wikidata guest speaker, to create this little query. So thanks, Will Kent. Now, what this particular query is going to let us do, and I say query as in this is our search that we are going to run through Wikidata, is that this query is going to allow us to generate a relational graph that is customizable and allows us to see much more of the story behind our visualizations and really lets us kind of customize it to our own needs. This particular query requires us to have unique query identifiers for our Wikidata items, which is called QIDs, or QIDs for short. So sifting through the entirety of Wikidata is going to be a pain, and there's also some much more comprehensive queries that we can run, but for us, we're just kind of focusing narrowly on these comics publishers to start with, right? So this is where our previous graph kind of comes into play. One of the great things about Wikidata Graph Builder, and here I'm going to move us back over to our other tab, is that when we click on one of these terms, let's say suspense stories, right? So left click on this, it actually pulls up that Wikidata page directly for that item. And this is really helpful for us because when we click on shock suspense stories, we get a QID, Q plus all these numbers up here. This entire thing, Q plus that number, is our QID for this term. And so when we go back to our query service, and here I have some notes in here that will help us kind of work through this. All we're going to do is go into our values line, which is this line here, line 7 and line 8. And we are going to copy and paste that thing in there, right? And then we're going to go back to our graph builder. We're going to do the same thing for all these terms. We're going to start with EC Comics. We'll go in, if I can get to the right tab. Thanks for your patience. We're going to copy that in with the WD, which means Wikidata term. And here we are copying in both of these into the exact same line so we can actually see the different relations and the different terms. I'll spare you the trouble of watching me painfully copy and paste all these things over. But what's going to happen is, if I go over to my fully completed one, I've copied over all of our terms from that graph that we just built. See here, should have about 11 or 12, I think. And what this is going to let us do is when we click this blue play button here, we will have a incredible visualization. Voila! It looks a little bit similar to, if I can zoom down, maybe I can't, great. 1 second, folks. And back. I have zoomed in. Magic of editing. Now, this looks similar to the graph that we built before, but it actually tells us where the publishers are, the notable works, right? These are Spy versus Spy, and William Gaines is noted as like being connected to Mad in different ways, as well as to EC Comics. But when we click on a term, let's say William Gaines, all of a sudden it kind of seems to explode, and we get all of these other terms that it is connected to, that William Gaines in particular is connected to within Wikidata, including Wiki Project, PCC, Wikidata Pilot, or Manhattan, where he worked, or whatever, right? And we can kind of do this for everything else. So we click on Tales from the Crypt. We get that it is listed as a comic book series, an instance of a comic book series. It was published in the United States of America in English, and also listed as a publisher with EC Comics. But then we also get to see that Alf Feldstein wrote for Tales from the Crypt, right? So we get to start kind of adding in more and more and more. And so when we click these things out, DC Comics has all of these listed here as well. And so we can start kind of adding and building in more of our narrative. Or if we just click off of it, it kind of minimizes back within there. It kind of unexplodes in its own way. So the reason why we're working with this is that we can start customizing this query for whatever you want to use. In groups, what you're going to do is you're going to be given and assigned a Golden Age comics publisher to do something with, to replicate the example that we built earlier, right? Using Fawcett and the other Comics Age publishers. You're going to end up creating something like this, but then we're actually going to let you loose and you can start customizing this to your own needs and to explore whatever you want. This template is for you to break. We have a static ID, and one of the great things about Wikidata Query is that we have whenever you create a query, you can generally create a permanent static ID. So you can go here, and I have this included in our notes, and customize it and mess around with it as much as you want to. As Will Kent likes to say, you can actually try and break this, and it's really difficult to do, almost impossible, because it mostly is just going to run the way that you want it to run, right? So that should be everything. Thank you for watching along. Feel free to reach out with any questions, and we look forward to working with you. So thanks, folks. Bye.